The empire that touched the sky. How could one of the greatest empires on earth collapse before most of its people even understood what was happening to them? High in the spine of the Andes Mountains, where the air grows thin and the clouds drift below stone citadels, the Inca Empire rose like something carved by the gods themselves. Roads stretched across mountains that seemed impossible to cross. Suspension bridges hung over roaring chasms, and terraced fields climbed steep slopes in perfect green steps, feeding millions in a land where farming should have been impossible. At its heart stood Cusco, the sacred city shaped, they said, like a puma, glittering with temples lined in gold, where the Sapa Inca, the divine ruler, lived not as a king, but as the living son of the sun. To the people of Tawantinsuyu, the realm of four parts, the empire did not feel fragile, it felt eternal. Everything about Inca life reinforced that sense of permanence. Messengers ran along royal highways with astonishing speed, carrying knots of colored cords called quipu that recorded taxes, harvests, and history itself. Storehouses along the roads overflowed with maize, dried potatoes, and textiles, ready to feed armies or villages struck by famine. Order was not just political, it was cosmic. The emperor ruled because the sun willed it. The mountains were sacred beings. The earth gave life because rituals kept the balance between humans and the spirits of the land. Generations had expanded the empire with discipline and strategy, absorbing distant peoples into a system that demanded labor and loyalty, but offered protection, food security, and belonging to something vast. From modern-day Colombia to Chile, cultures with different languages and traditions now walked the same roads and bowed to the same divine sovereign. It was an empire built without writing as Europeans knew it, without iron or wheels for transport, yet it rivaled any power across the ocean in organization and ambition. And because it had grown so quickly and so successfully, few stopped to ask how strong its foundations truly were. Success can hide cracks. Expansion can stretch unity thin. Power centered in one sacred ruler can become a weakness if that ruler falters. But in these early years of the 16th century, no one in the high cities of the Andes sensed that the world beyond the mountains was already moving toward them. No one imagined that events unfolding thousands of miles away across an ocean none of them had seen would soon ripple into their valleys like an unseen earthquake. Traders still moved through markets, priests still tended sacred fires, farmers still sang as they worked the terraces, and nobles still debated matters of state in stone courtyards warmed by the Andean sun. The empire felt vast, ordered, protected by distance and mountains that had defeated countless enemies before. Yet history does not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it approaches quietly, carried not by armies at first, but by whispers, by invisible forces, by consequences of contact that no one inside the empire has yet made. And so the Inca world stood at its peak, brilliant and confident, unaware that the first blow against it had already been struck, and that the greatest danger would not come in the form they expected.
The sickness that came before the strangers. Before steel, before horses, before a single foreign soldier set foot in the heart of the Andes, an invisible enemy began its work, and it moved faster than any army ever could. Imagine hearing rumors of a strange sickness in distant lands, tales carried along the empire's vast road network by messengers and traders, stories so strange they sounded like myths, entire villages struck down, people burning with fever, skin erupting in sores, families vanishing in days. At first, it must have seemed impossible, another exaggerated report from the fringes of the empire. But the Inca roads that once symbolized unity and strength now became silent highways for something no one could see and no ritual could easily stop. This was smallpox, though the Incas had no name for it, no memory of it in their histories, no natural resistance in their bodies. It traveled ahead of the Europeans like a dark shadow, passed from person to person, village to village, long before the strangers themselves were widely known. The disease did not respect rank or divine status. It struck commoners and nobles alike, and among its victims was Huayna Capac, the Sapa Inca himself, the son of the sun, whose rule had extended the empire to its greatest size. His death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a cosmic rupture. The divine center of the world had fallen to an illness no priest had foreseen, no ritual had prevented. And as if that were not enough, the heir chosen to follow him also died, leaving the empire without a clear successor. In a state where legitimacy came from divine lineage and ritual confirmation, this uncertainty was dangerous. Suddenly, Tawantinsuyu was not a single stable body, but a realm with a wound at its core. Two princes, Atahualpa in the north and Huáscar in Cusco, emerged as rivals, each with supporters, each claiming the right to rule. What might once have been settled through ceremony and consensus now unfolded against a backdrop of fear and grief. The smallpox epidemic had done more than reduce the population. It had shaken faith in the order of the universe. If the sun's own son could die from a mysterious plague, what did that mean about the balance between humans and the gods? Fields went untended in some regions as communities struggled to cope with losses. Skilled administrators, generals, and priests vanished, taking their knowledge with them. The empire's famous efficiency relied on human networks of trust, memory, and coordination, and those networks were fraying. Yet from the perspective of many Incas, the crisis still seemed internal, tragic but contained within their world. They did not yet see how this weakening, this division, would open a door for outsiders. The sickness had prepared the ground, loosening the stones of a structure that had once seemed unshakable. And far to the north, men with beards and steel were beginning to hear of a rich empire in the mountains, unaware that disease had already done what their weapons alone might never have achieved.
Brothers at war. What began as uncertainty over succession soon hardened into open conflict, and the civil war that followed would bleed the empire at the very moment it needed unity the most. After the deaths of Huayna Capac and his chosen heir, the question of who should rule Tawantinsuyu was no small matter of court politics. It was a struggle over the sacred center of the world. Huáscar, based in Cusco, the ancient capital, saw himself as the rightful Sapa Inca, guardian of tradition and ritual legitimacy. Atahualpa, ruling from the northern city of Quito, had grown powerful during his father's campaigns there and commanded the loyalty of battle-hardened generals and seasoned troops. What might once have been resolved through negotiation or ritual confirmation now turned into a brutal contest of armies, pride, and survival. The empire's vast road system, once a symbol of connection and order, now served to move troops toward one another. Brothers who shared the blood of the sun became enemies, and communities were forced to choose sides. The war was not a quick clash, but a drawn-out, grinding struggle. Cities were taken and retaken, loyalties tested, and punishments inflicted on those suspected of wavering. Armies that might have defended the empire's borders were instead turned inward, fighting fellow Incas in battles that left thousands dead. Fields were trampled, storehouses drained to feed soldiers, and labor that should have maintained terraces and roads was diverted to war. The carefully balanced system of tribute and redistribution began to strain under the weight of constant mobilization. Atahualpa's generals, notably Chalcuchimac and Quizquiz, proved ruthless and effective, gradually pushing Huascar's forces back toward Cusco. Each victory strengthened Atahualpa's claim, but also deepened the bitterness and fear across the realm. For ordinary people, the war meant uncertainty and suffering. Sons were taken into armies, villages saw passing troops seize supplies, and the promise that the Inca state would protect and provide began to feel hollow. The idea of the Sapa Inca as a benevolent, divinely guided ruler was being eroded by the sight of Inca soldiers fighting Inca soldiers. When Atahualpa's forces finally captured Huascar, the war effectively ended, but the damage was done. The empire was technically united again under Atahualpa, yet it was a wounded unity, forged through violence and resentment. Regions that had supported Huascar did not simply forget, and trust in the central authority had been shaken. Atahualpa, victorious but cautious, remained in the north near Cajamarca, consolidating power and rewarding loyal generals. He did not hurry to Cusco to complete the rituals that would fully legitimize his rule in the eyes of tradition. Perhaps he believed there was time. Perhaps he felt secure after defeating his brother. But while he celebrated victory and planned his next steps, news began to arrive of strange men on the coast, pale-faced, mounted on animals no Andean had ever seen, carrying thunder in their hands. The empire had just torn itself apart to decide who would rule it, and now, as it struggled to heal, a new threat was quietly approaching, one that neither Huascar nor Atahualpa had ever imagined.
While Atahualpa secured his fragile victory and the empire tried to breathe again after years of civil war, reports began to spread along the coast and into the highlands about beings who did not fit into any known category of the Andean world. Fishermen spoke of floating mountains with wings, ships unlike any balsa raft appearing on the horizon. Messengers brought word of men with pale skin, heavy beards, and coverings of shining metal that caught the sun like mirrors. They rode enormous deer that obeyed their commands and carried sticks that roared like thunder and spit smoke and death. At first, these stories sounded like myths, the kind of tales that travelers exaggerated to make their journeys seem more dramatic. But the reports did not stop. They multiplied. Villages along the northern coast described encounters that left them shaken and confused. These strangers demanded food, gold, and women. They seemed few in number, yet their confidence was absolute. They did not behave like emissaries of any known Andean state. They did not offer gifts before asking for tribute. They simply took.
To the Inca administration, this was deeply unsettling. The empire was used to incorporating new peoples through a mixture of diplomacy, ritual, and force, but always within a framework of understood customs. These newcomers ignored those customs entirely. Some local groups, long resentful of Inca rule, saw an opportunity. If these strangers were enemies of the Inca, perhaps they could be useful allies. Others were simply terrified. Messengers rushed along the royal road system toward Atahualpa's camp, carrying descriptions that sounded almost supernatural. Men who could not be wounded easily, animals that ran faster than any llama, weapons that killed from a distance with noise and fire. Atahualpa listened to these reports with curiosity more than fear. From his perspective, the empire had faced strange peoples before and had always prevailed. A small band of foreigners, however odd, did not seem like a serious threat to the vast armies at his command. He was, after all, the victorious ruler of a realm stretching from modern Colombia to central Chile. What could a handful of coastal intruders truly do? Yet even as he weighed these reports, the Spaniards, under Francisco Pizarro, were moving carefully inland, learning as much as they could about the political situation. They discovered that the empire had just endured a brutal civil war. They heard of Atahualpa's recent victory and of Huáscar's capture. They understood, perhaps better than many Incas, how divided the realm had become, and they began to plan not a direct assault on the empire's strength, but a strike at its heart. The strangers from the sea were not simply wandering adventurers. They were calculating, patient, and driven by hunger for wealth and glory. As they advanced toward Cajamarca, where Atahualpa was resting with his army, two worlds that had never imagined each other were about to collide, and the consequences would echo through centuries.
The Emperor waits. High in the Andean mountains, in the town of Cajamarca, Atahualpa made camp with the confidence of a ruler who believed destiny favored him. His armies filled the surrounding valleys, thousands of seasoned warriors resting after the long and brutal civil war. Tents stretched across the hillsides, storehouses were opened, and nobles attended the emperor with the rituals and deference expected in the presence of the Sapa Inca. The air was thin and cool, and from this high vantage point the empire felt secure once more. Messengers still arrived with strange reports of the foreigners moving inland, but to Atahualpa they remained a curiosity rather than a threat. He had defeated his brother, crushed internal rebellion, and commanded the loyalty of generals hardened by years of war. What could a few dozen unknown men truly do against the might of Tawantinsuyu? He decided to wait and observe rather than rush into confrontation. From the emperor's perspective, any encounter would be conducted on his terms. The strangers, if they wished to enter his realm, would present themselves as petitioners, awed by imperial power. Meanwhile, Francisco Pizarro and his small force of Spaniards approached Cajamarca with careful calculation. They had learned enough about the empire to understand that capturing the emperor himself could unravel the entire political structure. In the Inca world, authority flowed downward from the Sapa Inca like sunlight from Inti, the sun god. If that source could be controlled, everything beneath it might falter. The Spaniards were vastly outnumbered, but they had advantages they understood well: steel weapons, horses, firearms, and the element of shock. More importantly, they had a strategy built on deception and boldness. They sent messages requesting an audience with Atahualpa, presenting themselves as peaceful envoys of a distant king. The idea of such a small group daring to demand a meeting with the emperor would have seemed absurd under normal circumstances, but these were not normal times. The empire was still reeling from civil war, and Atahualpa, curious and perhaps slightly amused, agreed to meet them. He saw no risk. His army surrounded Cajamarca. The foreigners would be deep within Inca-controlled territory, far from reinforcements. If they proved troublesome, they could be crushed instantly. In his mind, this was an opportunity to display imperial grandeur and perhaps extract information about these unusual visitors. Preparations began for a ceremonial reception. Atahualpa would enter Cajamarca with a grand procession, carried on a litter of gold, surrounded by nobles and attendants. He would show these strangers the true scale of Inca power. Yet beneath the surface, misunderstandings ran deep. The Inca viewed diplomacy as a ritualized performance of status and hierarchy. The Spaniards viewed it as a tactical moment to strike. Neither side truly understood the other's worldview, and this gap in perception would prove more deadly than any weapon. As Atahualpa waited in Cajamarca, confident in his invincibility, the stage was being set for one of the most dramatic and decisive encounters in the history of the Americas, a meeting where confidence would meet desperation and where an empire's fate would hinge on a single afternoon.
The meeting in the square. Cajamarca was a quiet town of stone buildings and open courtyards resting high in the mountains as if suspended between earth and sky. When Atahualpa prepared to enter the city, he did so with all the ceremony of a divine ruler. His procession was not a military march, but a display of sacred authority. Nobles in feathered garments walked ahead, attendants swept the ground, and musicians played flutes and drums whose echoes drifted across the hills. The emperor himself sat upon a richly decorated litter carried by nobles of high rank, his clothing woven from the finest textiles, his ornaments gleaming with gold. He came unarmed, not because he felt vulnerable, but because he felt supreme. In his world, a ruler of his stature did not need weapons to command obedience. The Spaniards waited inside the main square of Cajamarca, hidden within the buildings that surrounded the open space. Pizarro had arranged his men carefully. Cavalry units were positioned behind doorways, ready to charge at a signal. Musketeers and crossbowmen stood prepared, their unfamiliar weapons loaded. Cannons, small but terrifying in their sound, were aimed toward the plaza. To the Incas, the square appeared empty, almost peaceful. The silence was deliberate. Pizarro intended to lure the emperor into the open, separated from the bulk of his army, which remained outside the city. As Atahualpa entered the plaza, he saw only a handful of Spaniards standing in the center. Among them was a friar, Vincenzo de Valverde, holding a cross and a book. Through interpreters, the friar attempted to explain that the Spaniards came in the name of their king and their God. He spoke of a single divine authority, of Christianity, of the need for Atahualpa to accept the rule of the Spanish crown. These words, translated imperfectly across languages and cultures, must have sounded strange and confusing. Atahualpa listened with curiosity, perhaps with mild irritation. He asked how the friar knew these things. Valverde handed him a Bible. The Inca ruler examined it, turning it in his hands, then held it to his ear as if expecting it to speak. When it remained silent, he dropped it to the ground. To the Spaniards, this act was sacrilege. To Atahualpa, It was likely nothing more than a rejection of an object that held no meaning for him. Valverde rushed back to Pizarro, claiming the emperor had insulted their faith and refused submission. It was the excuse Pizarro needed. He gave the signal. Suddenly, the quiet square exploded with violence. Cannons roared, their thunder echoing off the stone walls. Muskets fired, smoke filling the air. Horses burst from the buildings, armored riders charging into the stunned Inca attendants. The sound alone was devastating. The Incas had never seen horses in battle, never heard firearms. Panic spread instantly. Nobles tried to shield the emperor, lifting his litter higher to keep him above the chaos, but the Spaniards pressed forward with steel swords and lances. What had been a ceremonial meeting turned into a massacre within moments. The unarmed attendants fell in great numbers, unable to defend themselves against weapons that cut through armor of wood and cloth. Amid the confusion, Pizarro himself pushed toward Atahualpa's litter. His goal was clear: capture the emperor alive. Killing him might end resistance temporarily, but holding him prisoner could give the Spaniards control over the entire empire. After fierce struggle, they reached the litter, dragged Atahualpa down, and seized him. As the sun set over Cajamarca, the square was littered with Audis, and the divine ruler of the Inca Empire sat as a prisoner in the hands of fewer than 200 foreigners. In a single afternoon, the balance of power in the Andes had shifted forever.
A night after the massacre in Cajamarca was cold and unnaturally quiet, as if even the mountains were holding their breath. Inside a guarded room, Atahualpa, Sapa Inca, son of the sun, sat not on a golden throne, but on a simple bench, watched constantly by armed strangers whose language he did not understand. Only hours earlier, he had been carried through the Andes in triumph, worshipped as a living god. Now iron and fear surrounded him. Yet Atahualpa did not collapse into despair. Those who observed him later said he remained calm, even curious. He studied his captors just as they studied him, trying to understand what kind of men would dare lay hands on a ruler the entire Andean world believed divine. Pizarro understood the value of his prisoner immediately. The Spaniards had won a battle, but they had not conquered an empire. Outside Cajamarca waited tens of thousands of Inca soldiers, still loyal, still powerful, still unaware that their emperor was a captive. If they attacked in full force, the small Spanish force could be wiped out. Pizarro's only shield was Atahualpa himself. As long as the emperor lived, he was a bargaining chip, a hostage whose presence might prevent a massive counterattack. For the Incas, the situation was unthinkable. Their ruler had been taken not in honorable combat, but through trickery and chaos. Messengers rushed through the mountains carrying the news, and confusion spread across the empire. Many commanders hesitated. Should they attack the foreigners and risk killing the Sapa Inca? Or should they wait for orders that might never come? The political structure of the empire depended on the emperor's presence. Without him free and visible, authority became uncertain. Pizarro and his men quickly realized that Atahualpa still commanded enormous influence. Even in captivity, he could send messages. He could order nobles to gather supplies, to move armies, to obey instructions. The Spaniards allowed this, but only under watchful eyes.
They had no intention of freeing him. Instead, they saw an opportunity to turn his power into their advantage. Through interpreters, Atahualpa began to negotiate. He understood now that these men were not gods, not spirits, but ambitious humans driven by hunger for wealth. He had seen their eyes when they looked at gold ornaments in temples and palaces. He noticed how they reacted when servants brought them precious objects. Gold, which to the Incas was sacred and symbolic, seemed to hold a different, almost desperate importance for the Spaniards. Atahualpa made a proposal that would echo through history. He offered to fill the room in which he was imprisoned with gold as high as he could reach, and twice that amount in silver in exchange for his freedom. He raised his hand and marked a line on the wall, showing the height the treasure would reach. To the Spaniards, this promise was staggering. They had never imagined such wealth could exist in one place. Pizarro agreed, though privately he may never have intended to keep his word. Orders went out across the empire. From temples, palaces, and storehouses, gold objects were gathered: statues, ceremonial vessels, plates, jewelry, sacred ornaments. These were not coins or bars, but works of art, each one crafted with meaning and devotion. They were carried over mountains and valleys by runners and caravans, all for the life of a single man. Meanwhile, Atahualpa watched and waited. He believed that once the ransom was paid, he would be released and would rally his people to drive the foreigners out. But time was not on his side. The longer he remained a prisoner, the more the Spaniards learned about the empire's divisions. They discovered that Atahualpa had enemies among his own people, nobles who had supported his rival brother, Huascar. Some of these groups began to see the Spaniards not as invaders, but as potential allies against their internal rivals. The unity of the Inca world, already weakened by civil war, began to crack further. In that small room in Cajamarca, two empires faced each other, not with armies, but with fear, greed, and misunderstanding. Atahualpa believed gold could buy back his freedom. The Spaniards believed gold could buy them an empire. Only one of these beliefs would survive.
Across the vast spine of the Andes, a strange and desperate procession began. From the frozen highlands near Cusco, from the coastal valleys, from hidden temples carved into cliffs, precious objects were taken down from their sacred places and sent toward Cajamarca. Golden llamas, life-sized statues, ritual cups, ceremonial masks, sun discs from temples, and ornaments that had never before left the presence of the gods were stripped from their altars. Priests wept as they handed over sacred items. Nobles hesitated, then obeyed. The order had come in the name of the Sapa Inca. His life, they were told, depended on it. For the Inca, gold was not money. It was the sweat of the sun, a divine substance meant to honor their gods and decorate their temples. To melt it down for foreign captors felt like sacrilege, but the emperor's life outweighed even sacred tradition. If Atahualpa returned, the empire could recover. Without him, chaos might follow. And so caravans moved across the empire, guarded and urgent, carrying the wealth of a civilization toward a single room in a distant city. In Cajamarca, the Spaniards watched the treasure arrive with growing disbelief. Each new shipment confirmed that Atahualpa's empire was richer than anything they had imagined. The room where he was held slowly filled. Objects were stacked, measured, and marked. When the pile did not rise high enough, more was demanded. Gold was melted into bars for easier division among the conquerors, destroying irreplaceable works of art in the process. To the Spaniards, this was practical. To the Incas, it was the destruction of history and faith. While the room filled, Atahualpa remained a prisoner, yet still treated with a strange mix of respect and control. He dined well. He spoke through interpreters. He observed the Spaniards carefully, learning their habits, their rivalries, their ambitions. He also continued to rule in a limited way, sending messages and trying to maintain some sense of order in his empire. But every day he remained captive weakened his authority. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said he had already been killed. Others said he had become a puppet of the foreigners. In distant provinces, loyalty began to waver. For the Spaniards, the situation grew more complicated as well. The ransom was enormous, but it brought new problems. Once the gold was divided, many soldiers would be tempted to leave with their share. Others argued that releasing Atahualpa would be dangerous. A free emperor could rally tens of thousands of warriors and crush the small Spanish force. Some began to suggest a darker solution: keep the gold and remove the emperor. Meanwhile, Pizarro faced pressure from his own men. They were far from home, surrounded by a vast and unfamiliar empire. Fear mixed with greed. If they let Atahualpa go and he turned against them, everything they had gained could vanish in a single uprising. The room eventually reached the promised height. Gold and silver worth fortunes in Europe lay piled where a god-king had once slept. By the terms of the agreement, Atahualpa should have been freed, but promises made in conquest rarely survive the weight of ambition. The Spaniards held councils late into the night. They debated charges against the emperor, idolatry, rebellion, plotting against them. These accusations mattered little to the Incas, who did not share the same laws or beliefs, but they gave the Spaniards a justification that eased their conscience. Atahualpa, who had believed he was buying time and freedom, was instead buying his own destruction. The ransom that had drained the temples of the Andes had not saved him. It had only convinced his captors that they stood before a civilization rich enough to be conquered completely. In trying to save their emperor, the Incas unknowingly funded the very conquest that would end their world. After the gold was divided and the room stood empty, the Spaniards faced a decision that would shape the fate of the Andes. Atahualpa was still alive, still a symbol of authority for millions, and still a potential threat. Pizarro knew that as long as the emperor breathed, the empire might one day rally around him. Some of his men argued that Atahualpa had kept his promise and should be released. Others insisted that freeing him would be a mistake they would not survive. Fear and greed once again pushed events forward. A trial was announced. To the Incas, the very idea made little sense. Their emperor was divine, chosen by the sun, accountable only to the gods and the traditions of his ancestors. To be judged by foreign invaders speaking an unknown language was beyond humiliation. It was incomprehensible. Yet the Spaniards proceeded with the formality of law, as if a thin layer of procedure could justify what they had already decided. Atahualpa was accused of idolatry, of killing his brother Huascar, of plotting against the Spaniards, of resisting the true faith.
The charges were read in Spanish, translated imperfectly into a language that had no words for many of the concepts. Witnesses were called, many of them enemies of Atahualpa from the Civil War, eager to weaken his legacy. The outcome was never in doubt. For Pizarro's men, the trial was less about justice and more about safety. They were a few hundred soldiers in the heart of a vast empire. If Atahualpa was set free, he could disappear into the mountains, raise armies, and surround them. Even rumors of his survival were enough to keep provinces loyal to him. Removing him would break that invisible thread of unity. When the verdict was announced, Atahualpa was sentenced to death. For the Incas who heard of it, shock turned to disbelief, then to grief and rage. A world where the Sapa Inca could be killed by strangers was a world out of balance. Priests prayed, nobles whispered, messengers ran along the roads, but there was no army ready to storm Cajamarca. The empire, so efficient at administration and ceremony, was slow to react to an enemy that did not follow its rules. Atahualpa was offered one final choice. If he accepted baptism into the Christian faith, he would be spared the fate of burning at the stake and instead be strangled, a quicker death. The choice was cruel and symbolic. Accept the religion of his captors in his final hours, or die in a way the Spaniards considered fitting for a pagan. Faced with death, cut off from his people, Atahualpa agreed. He was given a Christian name, a brief ritual performed, and then, in the night, he was executed. News of his death spread slowly across the empire, carried by runners who had seen their emperor alive not long before. Confusion followed. Some refused to believe it. Others thought the Spaniards were lying. But as days turned to weeks and no royal command came from Cajamarca, the truth became impossible to ignore. The sun's son was gone, killed by men who had arrived only months before. For the Spaniards, the execution removed an immediate danger. For the Inca world, it shattered the center of everything. Authority flowed from the person of the emperor. Without him, power fragmented. Rival claimants emerged. Old loyalties shifted. The empire did not fall in a single moment, but the death of Atahualpa tore out its heart. The conquerors had learned a brutal lesson from history. Sometimes an empire is not destroyed by armies, but by removing the one figure who holds it together.
A puppet on the throne. With Atahualpa dead, the Spaniards faced a problem they had not fully anticipated. They had removed the emperor, but they had not yet replaced the system that depended on him. The Inca world was built on hierarchy, ritual, and divine authority. Without a Sapa Inca, the structure of governance faltered. Provinces hesitated, generals waited, nobles argued. The Spaniards understood enough to know they could not rule millions of people directly with a few hundred soldiers. They needed an emperor, but one who would obey them. So they searched for a suitable candidate among the royal bloodline, someone with legitimate ancestry but little power. They chose Tupac Hualpa, a brother of Huascar, one of the many sons of the previous emperor. To the Spaniards, he was a solution. To the Inca nobles, he was a compromise. Tupac Hualpa was crowned in a ceremony that mimicked tradition but lacked its sacred weight. The Spaniards attended, watching as rituals were performed in a language they barely understood, believing that by placing a new ruler on the throne, they could restore order.
But authority in the Andes did not come from ceremony alone. It came from belief, from lineage, from the sense that the emperor was chosen by the sun and protected by the gods. Many Incas saw Tupac Hualpa not as a true sovereign, but as a shadow placed there by foreigners. Even so, some provinces accepted him, if only to avoid chaos. Others hesitated, waiting to see how events would unfold. Meanwhile, the Spaniards began their march toward Cuzco, the sacred capital, with their new emperor traveling under their watch. The journey was tense. Along the road, villages greeted the procession with forced hospitality. Supplies were provided, labor was organized, but beneath the surface, resentment grew. The people saw armed strangers walking beside their emperor, issuing orders, demanding tribute, questioning traditions. The illusion of continuity was thin. It did not take long for that illusion to crack. Tupac Hualpa fell ill during the journey and died under suspicious circumstances. Some said disease claimed him. Others whispered of poison, of internal rivalries, of Spaniards deciding he was no longer useful. Whatever the truth, his death deepened the uncertainty. Once again, the empire had an emperor only briefly, and once again he was gone. The Spaniards did not give up. They selected another royal, Manco Inca, young and inexperienced, someone they believed they could control more easily. Manco was crowned in Cuzco with greater ceremony, and for a time he cooperated. He issued commands in the name of the conquerors, helped them gather gold and silver, and reassured the people that the world had not ended. But Manco was not blind. He saw the greed of the Spaniards, their disregard for sacred places, their cruelty toward his nobles. He understood that he was emperor in name only. The puppet strings were visible to everyone. The strategy of ruling through a figurehead worked, but only temporarily. The Spaniards gained legitimacy in the eyes of some and bought time to consolidate their control. Yet each false emperor weakened the sacred aura of the throne. The divine image of the Sapa Inca eroded, replaced by doubt and anger. Instead of stabilizing the empire, the false restorations revealed how deeply it had been wounded. The Inca state depended on trust in the emperor's sacred role. By turning that role into a tool, the Spaniards did more than occupy the land. They transformed the very meaning of power. In trying to control the empire from within, they slowly hollowed it out.
As the Spaniards advanced deeper into the Andes, the road itself became a symbol of both the empire's former strength and its growing vulnerability. The Capac Ñan, the vast network of stone highways that stitched the Inca world together, had once allowed messages to travel faster than armies and supplies to reach even the most distant provinces. Now those same roads carried armored strangers toward the heart of the empire. Each step they took was guided by the very infrastructure built to defend and unite the land. Bridges of woven fiber stretched across deep gorges, still maintained by local communities bound by ancient obligations. Storehouses along the route were opened to feed the invaders because the system of state labor and tribute still functioned even as the authority behind it weakened. Villagers watched from doorways as horses passed, animals unlike anything they had seen before, their riders wrapped in metal that flashed in the mountain sun. Fear traveled ahead of the Spaniards, carried by rumors of Cajamarca, of thunder weapons, and a god emperor executed by foreigners. Some communities offered gifts, hoping to avoid violence. Others sent quiet messages to rival factions, trying to guess which side would win and how best to survive. Meanwhile, Manco Inca, newly crowned yet already constrained, walked a careful path. He rode with the Spaniards, spoke on their behalf when needed, and tried to preserve what dignity he could. To his people he appeared compliant, to the Spaniards he seemed useful. Inside he was measuring them, learning their habits, their strengths, and their divisions. He saw how few they were, how dependent on allies, how greedy for gold. The road to Cuzco was not only a march of conquest, but a moving negotiation, a shifting balance between cooperation and coercion. Along the way, some Inca generals considered resistance. The empire still had thousands of warriors, men hardened by civil war and mountain campaigns, yet coordination had collapsed. Messages no longer flowed with certainty, loyalties were uncertain, and no single commander held the unquestioned authority to unite the forces. The Spaniards benefited from this hesitation. Each day they advanced without facing a unified army made their position stronger. When at last they approached Cuzco, the sacred center of the Inca universe, the city did not greet them with a decisive battle. Instead, tension hung in the air like thin mountain mist. Nobles debated, priests watched for omens, and ordinary citizens wondered whether the gods had turned their faces away. The Spaniards entered a city filled with temples of gold and walls fitted so precisely that not even a blade of grass could slip between the stones. They were awed but also emboldened. If such a magnificent capital could be reached with so little resistance, perhaps the empire was already hollow at its core. The arrival in Cuzco marked a turning point. What had begun as a daring gamble on a distant shore had become a foothold in the spiritual and political heart of the Andes. The roads that once symbolized unity had delivered the conquerors to the center of power, and the empire's greatest achievement in organization had been turned against itself.
Cuzco did not fall in a single clash of armies. It was taken in stages, through presence, pressure, and the slow tightening of control. When the Spaniards entered the city, they were both astonished and suspicious. They saw temples lined with gold plates, gardens where corn and llamas were shaped from precious metal, and walls of stone so perfectly cut that they seemed almost alive. Yet beneath their wonder was calculation. They understood that whoever held Cuzco held the symbol of imperial legitimacy. So they moved carefully, presenting themselves as allies of Manco Inca while placing guards at key locations, watching storehouses, and keeping a constant eye on the nobility. Manco, crowned as Sapa Inca with Spanish approval, found himself a ruler surrounded by foreign soldiers. He performed the rituals, wore the royal fringe, and received delegations, but every decision passed through invisible hands. The Spaniards demanded gold and silver as ransom payments had already accustomed them to immense wealth. Sacred objects were melted down, artworks destroyed, not out of hatred for their beauty, but because metal in the shape of a bar was easier to divide. Priests of the sun watched in silent horror as offerings accumulated over generations vanished into crucibles. For ordinary people, life continued in outward form. Fields were planted, herds tended, and labor obligations fulfilled, but the certainty that had underpinned daily routines was gone. Whispers spread that the newcomers argued among themselves, that some wanted to rule through Manco while others wanted to remove him entirely. The Spaniards, for their part, grew increasingly distrustful. They feared revolt, ambush, or poison. Their armor never left their sides, and their horses were kept ready. Each feast, each ceremony, each gathering of nobles was observed with wary eyes. Meanwhile, Factions within the Inca elite weighed their options. Some believed cooperation might preserve parts of the old order. Others saw humiliation where they once saw sacred authority and began to think of resistance. The presence of the Spaniards exposed deep fractures, rivalries between families, resentment from provinces that had been conquered by the Incas, and ambitions long suppressed by imperial unity. The conquerors exploited these divisions, granting favors, promising protection, and playing groups against one another. Manco Inca watched and learned. He saw how few Spaniards there really were, how dependent they were on allies and supplies, how their confidence sometimes slipped into carelessness. He also saw their brutality when angered, their quickness to imprison, torture, or execute. The capital became a stage where two systems overlapped but did not merge. The Inca world of ritual hierarchy and collective labor existed beside a Spanish world of individual greed, legal claims, and religious certainty. Tension built like pressure beneath stone. Outwardly, Cuzco was calm. Inwardly, it was a city waiting for a spark. For months, Manco Inca endured the role expected of him, smiling at ceremonies, offering tribute, and pretending that the old order still functioned beneath the new surface. But humiliation accumulated like dust on a sacred altar. Spanish soldiers entered temples without permission, demanded women of noble families, and mocked rituals they did not understand. What had begun as uneasy coexistence hardened into open contempt. Manco saw that he was not being prepared to rule, but to be controlled, used as a bridge between two worlds until he was no longer necessary. Stories reached him from across the highlands, forced labor increasing, local leaders threatened, sacred sites plundered for gold that had never been meant as currency. The empire he had inherited in fragments was now being dismantled piece by piece. He realized that survival through submission was an illusion. Each concession only invited another demand. Quietly, he began to prepare. Messengers moved along mountain paths, carrying knotted cords and whispered instructions. Former generals, provincial leaders, and warriors who had once fought on opposite sides were urged to unite, not for conquest, but for preservation. The memory of civil war was still fresh, but the presence of foreign rulers created a new common ground. Manco played a careful game in Cusco. He asked permission to conduct religious ceremonies outside the city, claiming he needed to fulfill ancient obligations. The Spaniards, overconfident and distracted by their own rivalries, allowed it. They saw him as a figurehead, not a strategist. Yet once beyond the city walls, Manco did not simply pray. He moved from valley to valley, rallying support, reminding people of shared traditions, invoking the sun not only as a god, but as a symbol of unity. He spoke of dignity, of ancestors, of a world where their own laws still held meaning. In villages and fortresses, weapons were quietly prepared. Slings were braided, spears sharpened, and storehouses filled. Unlike the Spaniards, the Inca forces did not rely on horses or firearms, but they knew the land intimately. They understood passes, ravines, and hidden trails that could trap an enemy far from help. Back in Cusco, Spanish leaders grew suspicious. Rumors of unrest reached them, and they began to argue about how to handle Manco. Some wanted to arrest him immediately. Others feared provoking the very rebellion they hoped to prevent. Their hesitation gave him time to plan, to gather, to transform scattered anger into coordinated resistance. When he finally returned to Cusco, he wore the calm expression of a compliant ruler, but his mind had already shifted from endurance to action. He knew that rebellion would be costly and uncertain. The Spaniards' weapons were deadly, their alliances unpredictable. Yet doing nothing meant watching his world dissolve slowly, temple by temple, law by law. The decision formed not in a single dramatic moment, but through the steady recognition that the future offered only two paths: submission without honor, or resistance with risk. Manco chose resistance. The capital still appeared peaceful, markets open and ceremonies performed, but beneath the surface, messages continued to move, plans took shape, and an empire that had once expanded through conquest now prepared to fight for its own survival.
When the uprising finally began, it did not start with a single shout or trumpet blast, but with the sudden realization among the Spaniards that the mountains themselves seemed to be closing in. From the hills surrounding Cuzco, thousands of Inca warriors appeared, moving along ridgelines and terraces with the silent coordination of people who had prepared for months. Fires burned on distant slopes as signals passed from valley to valley, and the capital, once the heart of an empire, became a trap for its new rulers. Manco Inca did not attack recklessly. He understood that the Spaniards' strength lay in open field combat, in cavalry charges and gunfire that shattered formations. Instead, he aimed to isolate them, to cut off supplies, to force them into a defensive posture within the city walls. Roads were blocked, bridges dismantled, and messenger routes severed. The Inca forces controlled the surrounding high ground, a position of advantage in any siege, especially in a landscape of steep slopes and narrow approaches. Inside Cuzco, the Spaniards scrambled to fortify their positions. They occupied stone buildings, converted temples into strongholds, and relied heavily on their horses to break through enemy lines when necessary. The clash between the two sides was not merely military, but symbolic. The Spaniards defended themselves within structures that had once represented Inca power, while the Inca besieged their own former capital, trying to reclaim it without destroying it completely. Skirmishes erupted daily. Inca slingers targeted Spanish soldiers from rooftops and terraces, their stones capable of crushing skulls and shattering armor joints. Spears and clubs met steel swords in brutal close combat in narrow streets. The Spaniards' firearms created terror with their noise and smoke, but ammunition was limited and reloading took precious time. Each side adapted, learning from the other's tactics. The Inca even attempted to set fire to parts of the city to flush the Spaniards out, though this pained them, as they risked damaging their own sacred and historic buildings. Manco directed the siege from nearby strongholds, maintaining communication with his commanders through runners who knew hidden paths. He hoped that time and pressure would break Spanish resolve, that hunger and isolation would force surrender. Yet the Spaniards were stubborn and desperate. They launched daring counterattacks, using cavalry charges to scatter Inca troops in open areas, creating temporary openings to gather supplies or reposition forces. The psychological strain on both sides was immense. For the Inca, the sight of foreigners occupying their capital was a constant wound. For the Spaniards, the sense of being surrounded in a hostile land far from reinforcements weighed heavily. Weeks stretched into months.
The siege showed that the Inca could coordinate on a massive scale even after the shock of conquest, but it also revealed the difficulty of defeating a smaller force armed with unfamiliar technology and driven by the knowledge that retreat meant death. Cuzco became a symbol of stalemate, a place where the old world and the new collided without either side achieving a decisive victory. Manco's rebellion had transformed from a bold gamble into a prolonged struggle, and the outcome remained uncertain. As the siege of Cuzco dragged on, and the Spaniards refused to break, Manco Inca realized that reclaiming the old capital might not be enough to restore his people's freedom. The struggle had to spread beyond one city and become a wider war across the Andes. From his command posts in the highlands, he sent messengers racing along hidden paths to call on distant communities, urging them to rise, to cut off Spanish routes, to attack isolated outposts and convoys. The rebellion began to ripple outward like shock waves through the sacred valley, the fertile corridor that had long fed and sustained the Inca heartland. Villages that had endured months of forced labor and humiliation seized the moment to resist. Spanish farms were raided, storehouses emptied, and supply lines severed. The landscape itself became a weapon. Mountain passes were blocked with landslides, bridges destroyed, and narrow trails turned into ambush points where Inca fighters could strike and vanish before cavalry could respond. The Spaniards suddenly found themselves in a hostile countryside where every ridge might conceal enemies. Inca commanders coordinated attacks with a level of organization that surprised their foes. They did not rely solely on frontal assaults, but used the terrain to their advantage, luring small Spanish forces into valleys where escape was difficult. Stones rolled from above could do as much damage as blades. Slingers targeted horses, knowing that without cavalry, the Spaniards lost much of their mobility and shock power. In some areas, the rebellion came close to cutting the Spaniards off entirely from coastal reinforcements, raising the possibility that the conquest might yet be reversed. Yet the conflict also revealed the limits of Inca resistance. The empire had once been united under a single ruler whose authority reached from one end of the Andes to the other. Now, loyalties were more fragmented. Some groups, resentful of Inca dominance before the Spanish arrived, hesitated to join Manco's cause, or even sided with the newcomers. The Spaniards exploited these divisions, recruiting indigenous allies who knew the terrain and could serve as guides, scouts, and additional soldiers. These alliances weakened the rebellion's reach and made it harder for Manco to achieve the sweeping coordination he needed. Violence intensified in the Sacred Valley as both sides fought for control of key locations. Fields were trampled, terraces damaged, and irrigation systems disrupted. The conflict began to erode the very agricultural base that sustained Andean life. For local communities, the conflict meant hunger as well as fear. The Spaniards retaliated harshly against villages suspected of supporting the rebellion, burning homes and taking captives. Each act of repression fueled more anger, but also deepened suffering. Manco faced a grim reality. Even if he inflicted heavy losses, he could not easily dislodge the Spaniards without a decisive victory or their complete isolation. The rebellion's initial momentum slowed as the invaders adapted, fortified their positions, and reopened some supply lines. The sacred valley, once a symbol of Inca abundance and order, became a battleground scarred by fire and blood. Still, the uprising proved that the conquest was not a simple, uncontested takeover. It was a prolonged and bitter struggle in which the outcome hung in the balance far longer than the Spaniards had expected.
As the rebellion spread and then slowly began to falter, Manco Inca understood that holding the old centers of power was no longer possible. Cuzco remained in Spanish hands, and the Sacred Valley had become too dangerous and exposed to serve as the heart of resistance. The Spaniards had reinforced their positions, built stronger defenses, and drawn more allies to their side. Every month the balance shifted further against the rebels. Manco now faced a decision that would change the course of Andean history. Rather than die in a doomed last stand near the ancient capital, he would withdraw to a place the Spaniards could not easily reach. He chose the deep jungle valleys to the northwest, a region of steep ridges, thick forests, and narrow river gorges that lay beyond the familiar highland world of terraces and stone cities. This remote zone, later known as Vilcabamba, would become the final refuge of the Inca state. The journey from the highlands into the jungle was not just a physical retreat, but a symbolic crossing into a different kind of existence. The great paved roads of the empire gave way to muddy paths and hanging bridges over rushing rivers. The air grew heavier, the vegetation denser, the climate warmer and more unpredictable. For nobles and officials raised in the ordered environment of Cuzco, the move felt like exile at the edge of the known world. Yet for Manco, it was a strategic choice. The Spaniards' greatest strengths, horses, armor, and tight formations, were far less effective in tangled forests and narrow ravines. In Vilcabamba, the Incas could rebuild, reorganize, and continue the struggle on their own terms. As the royal court relocated, they carried with them not only weapons and supplies, but also the symbols of imperial legitimacy, sacred objects, ritual knowledge, and the memory of what the empire had been. Manco set about establishing a new capital, smaller and less grand than Cuzco, but still infused with the traditions of Inca rule. Terraces were carved into the hillsides, storehouses built, and temples raised. Priests resumed ceremonies to honor the sun and the ancestral spirits, asserting that the divine order had not been broken, only displaced. In this hidden enclave, the Inca state survived in miniature, a shadow of its former self, but still a political and spiritual center for resistance. For the Spaniards, Vilcabamba became a frustrating enigma. They knew Manco had not surrendered, but the geography of the region made large-scale campaigns difficult. Expeditions sent into the jungle often returned with little to show for their effort, harassed by ambushes and worn down by disease and exhaustion. The very remoteness that made Vilcabamba a hardship for its inhabitants also protected it. From this sanctuary, Manco continued to send out raids, to negotiate with distant groups, and to keep alive the hope that the Spanish presence might one day be pushed back. Yet the retreat also marked a turning point. By abandoning the old heartlands, the Inca resistance conceded that the vast imperial structure that had once unified the Andes was gone. What remained was a rump state, defiant but isolated. The empire that had stretched from Ecuador to Chile was now compressed into a pocket of forested mountains. Survival replaced expansion as the primary goal. The struggle shifted from reclaiming a lost world to preserving a fragment of it for as long as possible. In the deep valleys of Vilcabamba,
The last chapter of the Inca story began, not with triumphant marches and grand ceremonies, but with a quiet, determined refusal to disappear.
In Vilcabamba, the Inca state did not vanish into myth, but reshaped itself into something quieter, smaller, and far more fragile. A kingdom that survived not through grand armies or monumental cities, but through memory, ritual, and stubborn endurance. As Manco Inca ruled from this hidden refuge, surrounded by loyal nobles, warriors, priests, and families who had followed him into exile, believing that as long as an Inca still sat upon a throne, the world had not fully ended, and the gods had not entirely abandoned them. And so, life in this shadow kingdom took on a strange mixture of defiance and melancholy, as terraces were carved into the jungle slopes, maize planted in clearings hacked from thick vegetation, storehouses filled again, and ceremonies held to honor Inti the sun, even though the great golden temples of Cuzco were now in foreign hands and the sacred heart of the empire had been torn away. Yet within these remote valleys, the Incas tried to recreate a smaller version of the world they had lost, appointing officials, maintaining records through quipu cords, and training young nobles in traditions that had once governed millions across the Andes, while scouts kept watch on distant passes and messengers moved quietly between allied communities still willing to resist Spanish rule. But the reality pressing in on Vilcabamba was impossible to ignore. As trade routes shrank, resources grew scarcer, and each year fewer outside groups dared to openly support the hidden Inca king for fear of Spanish reprisals. And so the kingdom became more isolated, its people bound together by shared loss and a deep sense that they were the last guardians of a fading order. Children grew up knowing only exile, hearing stories of cities of stone and roads stretching beyond the horizon that they would never see. Elders spoke of festivals that once filled plazas with music and color, while now ceremonies were held in forest clearings under dripping leaves and heavy skies. And still Manco Inca held court, judged disputes, led rituals, and planned resistance, sending out small war parties to harass Spanish outposts or disrupt supply lines, reminding friend and foe alike that the Inca state had not been extinguished but merely driven into hiding. Yet each raid risked retaliation, and each loss weighed heavily, because the pool of warriors was limited, and the kingdom could not afford many defeats. Inside Vilcabamba, hope and fear lived side by side, as some believed the Spaniards would eventually tire, leave, or be weakened by their own conflicts, while others saw the steady expansion of Spanish towns, farms, and churches across the highlands, and understood that the old world was being replaced piece by piece. And through all of this, the most powerful force holding the kingdom together was not weapons or walls, but belief. Belief that the Sapa Inca was still chosen by the sun. Belief that the empire might one day rise again. Belief that their struggle had meaning, even if victory seemed distant. And so Vilcabamba endured, as a kingdom in the shadows, not grand enough to threaten Spanish dominance, yet too persistent to be forgotten. A living reminder that conquest had not erased the Inca identity, only pushed it to the margins, where it waited, watched, and refused to disappear. As the years passed in Vilcabamba, the fragile balance between resistance and survival grew ever more delicate, and the hidden kingdom that had once pulsed with renewed purpose began to feel the strain of isolation, dwindling alliances, and constant vigilance.
Yet within this tension lay an unexpected danger, not from Spanish soldiers, but from men who had once served them. A small group of Spaniards who had fled justice in the colonial cities and sought refuge with Manco Inca, presenting themselves as outcasts willing to fight against their former masters. And at first their arrival seemed like an opportunity, for they brought knowledge of Spanish weapons, tactics, and weaknesses, and Manco, still searching for any advantage that might tilt the balance, allowed them into his court, granting them shelter in the remote valleys where trust was a precious but necessary risk. But the presence of these foreigners carried a silent poison, for they were not bound by loyalty to the Inca world, nor by reverence for its sacred order. They were men driven by desperation and self-interest, and as months turned into years, their uneasy position deepened into resentment, their hopes of safety and reward fading as they realized that life in Vilcabamba offered little wealth and no clear path back to power. And so, in a moment that would echo as one of the final betrayals of the Inca resistance, these men turned on the very king who had given them refuge, striking down Manco Inca in a sudden act of violence that shattered the fragile sense of continuity the exiled state had preserved. The news spread through Vilcabamba like a cold wind, disbelief giving way to grief and fury as nobles and warriors understood that their leader had not fallen in glorious battle against the conquerors, but to treachery within his own walls. And the assassins, knowing they had sealed their fate, tried to escape through the jungle, but were hunted down and killed, their bodies a small and hollow repayment for the loss they had caused. Yet Manco's death marked more than the end of a man. It marked the end of the last leader who had personally known the empire at its height, who had ruled from Cuzco, who had commanded the great siege and believed deeply that the Spaniards might still be driven out. His successors would inherit the title of Sapa Inca and the fragile kingdom of Vilcabamba, but they would rule in a world where hope of restoring the old empire had dimmed, where survival and dignity became the primary goals. And so the assassination of Manco Inca stands as a grim turning point, showing how the fall of the Inca world was not only shaped by battles and foreign steel, but also by betrayal, exhaustion, and the slow erosion of trust in a land where every alliance carried danger. And from this moment forward, Vilcabamba would no longer be the stronghold of a king who had once dreamed of reconquest, but the refuge of a fading dynasty, trying to preserve a legacy that seemed to slip further away with each passing year. After the death of Manco Inca, the hidden kingdom of Vilcabamba did not collapse at once, but passed into the hands of his successors, rulers who inherited a throne surrounded by jungle instead of stone walls, and a realm defined more by memory than by territory. And though they continued to bear the sacred title of Sapa Inca, their authority rested on a far smaller world, one where survival required caution, negotiation, and the careful preservation of tradition rather than bold campaigns of reconquest. First came Sayri Tupac, a young ruler raised in exile who faced a choice his father had refused to consider: the possibility of peace with the Spaniards. Emissaries from the colonial authorities reached into the jungle, offering pardon, wealth, and noble status within the Spanish order if he would leave Vilcabamba and submit. And after years of isolation and dwindling resources, the offer held a powerful appeal. Sayri Tupac eventually accepted, emerging from the forest to live under Spanish oversight, baptized and granted estates. His departure weakening the symbolic unity of the resistance, but also showing how the conquerors were learning to absorb rather than simply destroy. Yet Vilcabamba did not end with him. His brother Titu Cusi Yupanqui later took the throne and tried to walk a narrow path between defiance and diplomacy, allowing missionaries to enter, negotiating with Spanish officials, and seeking to protect his people from direct assault. But mistrust ran deep on both sides. Misunderstandings and suspicions fueled tension, and when Titu Cusi died under unclear circumstances, Spanish leaders blamed resistance factions, while Incas feared poisoning or betrayal. And so the fragile balance shattered again. The final ruler, Tupac Amaru, inherited not a kingdom poised between war and peace, but one surrounded by suspicion and increasingly seen by the Spaniards as a threat that had to be eliminated once and for all. And by now the Inca state in Vilcabamba had become a symbol more than a military force, a reminder that the conquest of the Andes had never been fully complete. For as long as an Inca king ruled beyond Spanish control, the idea of a restored empire could not be entirely erased. And this lingering symbol would draw the attention of the colonial authorities, who believed stability required a decisive end. The story of the last Inca kings reveals how the fall of the empire did not occur in a single dramatic moment, but unfolded over decades through compromise, fragmentation, and the slow narrowing of choices, each step bringing the Inca dynasty closer to a final confrontation it could no longer avoid. And in their shifting strategies, we see both resilience and tragedy. Rulers trying to preserve dignity, culture, and life in a world that had changed beyond recognition.
By the time Tupac Amaru took the throne in Vilcabamba, the world of the Inca had shrunk to a narrow strip of forested valleys and mountain ridges, a hidden kingdom surrounded by a colonial order that had grown stronger, richer, and more confident with each passing year. And to the Spanish authorities, the continued existence of an independent Inca ruler had become more than a distant curiosity. It was a lingering challenge to their claim of complete dominion over the Andes. Rumors spread of unrest, of alliances forming in secret, of the possibility that the symbol of an Inca king might inspire resistance far beyond the jungle refuge. And so, in the early 1570s, the decision was made to end the matter permanently. A Spanish expedition marched toward Vilcabamba with the clear goal of capturing the last Sapa Inca and dissolving the final remnant of the old state. Tupac Amaru, younger and less experienced than his predecessors, tried to flee deeper into the mountains when the attack came, but the network of trails and hiding places that had once protected the kingdom could not shield it forever. Spanish forces advanced steadily, burning settlements and capturing leaders, until the last Inca ruler was taken prisoner and brought in chains to Cuzco, the city that had once been the heart of their ancestors' empire. And there, in a public display meant to erase the final shadow of imperial authority, Tupac Amaru was executed, his death marking not just the end of a man, but the end of a political lineage that had ruled the Andes for generations. The people who witnessed it understood the weight of the moment, even if they did not speak it aloud, for with his fall, the last independent Inca state was gone.
Yet the story of how the Inca Empire really fell does not end with that execution alone. It stretches back through years of disease, civil war, betrayal, adaptation, and resistance, showing that empires rarely collapse in a single blow, but unravel slowly, weakened from within before being struck from without. The Spanish conquest succeeded not only because of steel and horses, but because the empire they faced had already been shaken by forces it could not control. And so the fall of the Inca was not a sudden disappearance, but a long fading, a transformation from a vast and organized state into scattered communities, memories, and traditions that would endure in new forms under colonial rule. The line of Sapa Incas ended on that day in Cuzco, but the people and culture they had led did not vanish. And in that survival, we find the final chapter of a story that began with a world touching the sky and ended with a legacy that refused to die, even as the empire itself passed into history.